The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his dress blue uniform one final time. The fabric felt heavier than usual, weighted not just by the medals adorning his chest, but by the significance of this moment. He was about to become part of something unprecedented in military history. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the United States Marine Corps, earning distinction for his unwavering discipline and precision under pressure. His posture was perfect, his bearing immaculate, and his reputation for maintaining absolute stillness during ceremonial duties was legendary among his peers. When the opportunity arose for an international military exchange program between the U.S. Marines and the British Royal Guard, Marcus was the natural choice. The exchange had been months in planning, a diplomatic gesture designed to strengthen the alliance between the two nations. For 1 week, Marcus would stand guard alongside the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace, while a member of the Royal Guard would perform similar duties at Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. It was meant to be a quiet, respectful demonstration of military cooperation. What nobody anticipated was Lance Corporal James Wellington. James had been part of the Queen's Guard for over 4 years, and in that time he had developed a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with shoulders that seemed carved from granite, James possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless for hours at a time. His fellow guardsmen often joked that he could probably stand at attention during an earthquake without so much as a tremor. The British press had caught wind of the exchange and began building it up as more than just a diplomatic gesture. Headlines appeared in newspapers across London, suggesting that the 2 elite military units would be put to the ultimate test of discipline and endurance. The story captured the public imagination in a way that surprised everyone involved. On that first morning, Marcus arrived at the palace gates to find a small crowd already gathering. Word had spread through social media that something special was happening, and curious tourists mingled with local Londoners who had come to witness what many were calling an unofficial competition between 2 of the world's most disciplined military forces. Marcus was introduced to James in the guardroom beneath the palace. The 2 men sized each other up with the professional courtesy common among elite soldiers. James extended his hand with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to London, Marine," James said in his crisp accent. "I trust you're prepared for what we do here." Marcus gripped the offered hand firmly. "Thank you for having me, Corporal. I'm looking forward to learning from the best." There was something in that exchange, a subtle challenge that both men recognized but neither acknowledged aloud. It was the kind of unspoken competition that existed between all elite units, a professional pride that demanded excellence not just from oneself, but in comparison to others who claimed similar standards. The commanding officer briefed them on their duties for the day. They would be stationed at the main gate, standing guard in the traditional fashion while tourists and visitors passed by. It was meant to be routine, ceremonial duty that both men had performed countless times before. As they took their positions outside the palace gates, neither Marcus nor James could have predicted what would unfold over the next several hours. The crowd that had started small began to grow as word spread throughout London that an American Marine and a British Royal Guard were standing side by side. The morning passed quietly at first. Both men maintained perfect military bearing, their eyes focused straight ahead, their bodies absolutely still. Tourists took photos, children pointed and whispered, and the usual flow of palace visitors continued without incident. But as the sun climbed higher and the crowd grew larger, something began to shift in the atmosphere around them. People started to linger longer, watching both guards with increasing fascination. Comments began to circulate about which guard seemed more disciplined, more focused, more perfectly still. By noon, what had started as casual observation had evolved into something more intense. Spectators were positioning themselves to get better views of both guards, comparing their posture, their breathing, the steadiness of their gaze. Social media posts began appearing with photos of the 2 men, accompanied by commentary about their respective Military traditions and training. Marcus became aware of the scrutiny but maintained his focus. Years of training had taught him to block out distractions, to exist in a state of controlled awareness where external pressures couldn't penetrate his concentration. He had stood guard in places where the stakes were life and death, where a moment's inattention could have deadly consequences. A crowd of curious tourists presented no challenge to his discipline. James, for his part, felt the familiar rhythm of duty settling over him. He had performed this role in front of thousands of people, through rain and shine, during state visits and ordinary days alike. The presence of cameras and crowds was nothing new, though he couldn't help but notice that today felt different. Somehow, the afternoon brought new challenges as the crowd continued to grow. Tour guides began incorporating the unusual pairing into their presentations, explaining to visitors that they were witnessing a rare display of military cooperation between allied nations. The story began to take on a life of its own as people shared photos and videos online, each post generating more interest and drawing more spectators to the scene. Neither guard showed any sign of fatigue or distraction as the hours passed. Their training had prepared them for exactly this kind of endurance test, though neither had expected it to become such a public spectacle. The weight of representing their respective nations began to settle over both men, adding an extra layer of significance to what should have been routine duty. As the day wore on, subtle details began to emerge that only the most observant spectators noticed. The way Marcus's breathing remained perfectly controlled even as the temperature rose. The manner in which James's gaze never wavered despite the increasing number of camera flashes. Small signs that both men were not just performing their duties, but performing them at the highest possible level. The crowd sensed something building, though they couldn't quite articulate what it was. There was an electricity in the air, a feeling that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple changing of the guard ceremony. People began to settle in for longer periods, some bringing chairs or finding places to sit on nearby steps and benches. As evening approached and the first shift prepared to end, both Marcus and James had maintained their positions with absolute precision for over 6 hours. Neither had shown the slightest sign of weakness or fatigue. The crowd that had gathered to watch them had grown to several hundred people, all drawn by the inexplicable magnetism of watching two masters of their craft, performing at the peak of their abilities. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning of something that would captivate not just London, but the entire world. The second day dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that had driven away many tourists from other attractions around the city. But the gates of Buckingham Palace told a different story entirely. Word of the previous day's display had spread throughout the night, and by 8 in the morning, a crowd of over 1,000 people had gathered to witness what local news stations were now calling the silent standoff. Marcus arrived at the palace to find reporters waiting outside the guardroom. The story had caught the attention of international media, with news crews from CNN, BBC, Sky News, and dozens of other outlets setting up equipment along the palace perimeter. What had started as a simple military exchange had somehow transformed into a global phenomenon. "This is bloody mental," James muttered as he adjusted his bearskin cap, watching the growing crowd through the window. "I've never seen anything like this for a routine guard duty." Marcus nodded, though he kept his thoughts to himself. In his years of service, he had learned that sometimes the smallest moments could take on the biggest meanings. He had seen how crowds could turn ordinary events into extraordinary ones simply through the power of collective attention. The commanding officer briefed them again, this time with additional instructions about dealing with media attention and crowd control. Palace security had been increased, and barriers were being erected to manage the growing number of spectators. "Gentlemen," the officer said, his tone serious, "I want to be clear that your duty remains the same regardless of the circus that's developed around you. You are here to guard the palace, not to put on a show. Maintain your discipline, follow protocol, and ignore everything else." Both men acknowledged the orders, but as they prepared to take their positions, they could feel the weight of expectation settling over them like a heavy cloak. Thousands of people had come specifically to watch them, and many more were following the story online and on television. As they emerged from the palace and took their positions, the crowd fell into an almost reverent silence. Camera shutters clicked constantly, but the spectators seemed to understand instinctively that this was something requiring quiet observation rather than loud celebration. The morning passed differently than the day before. Where the previous day had felt like normal duty with an unusually large audience, today felt charged with significance. Both guards could sense the intensity of the observation, the way every slight movement or adjustment was being scrutinized by hundreds of eyes and dozens of cameras. Around midday, something unprecedented happened. A group of veterans, recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing, began to form an informal honor guard around the perimeter of the crowd. These were men and women who had served in various branches of the British and American militaries, and they positioned themselves to help maintain order and show respect for the two active duty personnel. An elderly man wearing a Royal Navy veteran's cap approached the barriers and stood at attention for nearly an hour, his aged frame ramrod straight despite the obvious difficulty it caused him. Word spread through the crowd about who he was, and soon other spectators were following his example, standing quietly and respectfully rather than treating the scene as entertainment. The transformation of the crowd's behavior seemed to affect both guards in subtle ways. Marcus found his focus sharpening even further, his awareness of the honor he was representing becoming more acute. James felt a similar shift, a deeper connection to the traditions and responsibilities that his uniform represented. As the afternoon progressed, the weather began to worsen. What had started as a light drizzle evolved into a steady rain, then into a proper downpour. The sensible thing for the crowd to do would have been to seek shelter, to return when conditions improved. Instead, umbrellas appeared, raincoats were donned, and the vast majority of spectators remained in place. The rain presented a new challenge for both guards. Their uniforms, while designed for all weather conditions, became heavier as they absorbed moisture. Visibility decreased as water ran down their faces, and the cold began to seep through even their well-designed gear, but neither man moved. Neither adjusted their stance, wiped their face, or showed any acknowledgement of the discomfort they must have been experiencing. They stood like statues in the downpour, their discipline absolute and unwavering. The crowd watching them seemed mesmerized by this display of determination. Here were two human beings demonstrating a level of commitment and endurance that most people couldn't imagine achieving. The silence that had fallen over the spectators was now broken only by the sound of falling rain and the occasional whispered comment of amazement. News reports were now broadcasting live from the scene, with reporters struggling to explain to their audiences exactly what they were witnessing. "It's impossible to capture in words," one BBC correspondent said into her microphone, rain streaming down her face. "These two men have been standing in this downpour for hours without moving, and the crowd watching them is equally committed to staying and witnessing this extraordinary display." Social media exploded with posts about the scene. Photos and videos were being shared millions of times, with hashtags like silent standoff and guard duty trending worldwide. Comments poured in from people around the globe, many expressing amazement at the level of discipline being displayed, others debating which military tradition was superior. But for Marcus and James, the external noise had faded into background static. They had entered that zone that all elite soldiers know, where physical discomfort becomes irrelevant and the only thing that exists is the mission. Their mission was simple: stand guard, maintain position, honor their respective services and nations. As evening approached and the rain finally began to ease, both men had been on duty for nearly 8 hours. They had stood through sunshine, rain, cold, and the intense scrutiny of thousands of people. Neither had faltered, neither had shown weakness, neither had given any indication that they were anything other than perfectly capable of continuing indefinitely. The crowd, now numbering in the thousands despite the weather, began to show signs of the same kind of endurance. People had been standing for hours in difficult conditions, but something about watching these two guards perform their duty with such absolute commitment had inspired them to match that determination in their own small way. Children who had been restless and complaining earlier in the day now stood quietly beside their parents, somehow understanding that they were witnessing something important. Elderly spectators who should have been exhausted remained alert and attentive. Tourists who had planned to spend only a few minutes at the palace had now been there for hours. As the shift change approached, a new dynamic emerged. Word began to spread through the crowd that both guards were scheduled to return the following day for their final rotation together. The diplomatic exchange was meant to last only 3 days, after which Marcus would return to his regular duties and James would resume his normal schedule. The realization that this extraordinary display might be coming to an end seemed to energize the crowd rather than disappoint them. People began making plans to return the next day, to witness the conclusion of what many were now calling one of the most impressive demonstrations of military discipline they had ever seen. But beneath the public spectacle, something more profound was developing between the two guards themselves. Standing side by side for hours in conditions that tested every aspect of their training had created a bond that transcended national boundaries and military rivalries. They were no longer representing competing traditions, but embodying the universal values that all elite warriors share: dedication, honor, and an uncompromising commitment to excellence. As they finally stood down for the day, neither man spoke immediately. They had shared an experience that didn't require words, that couldn't be adequately expressed through normal conversation. They had pushed each other to new levels of performance simply through mutual respect and professional pride. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, many people lingering to take final photos or simply to absorb the significance of what they had witnessed. Tomorrow would bring the final day of the exchange, and everyone sensed that something even more extraordinary might be in store. Dawn broke clear and crisp over London on the third and final day, but the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace was unlike anything in the venue's long history. The crowd that had gathered overnight numbered in the tens of thousands, stretching back through the surrounding streets in a display of public interest that authorities had never seen for a simple guard. Ceremony. International news crews from over 40 countries had established positions around the palace. The story had captured global attention in a way that surprised government officials on both sides of the Atlantic. Military leaders from around the world were watching, wondering how two soldiers performing routine duty had managed to inspire such widespread fascination. Marcus arrived to find his commanding officer waiting with updated orders that reflected the unprecedented situation. "Son," the colonel said, "I've received calls from the Pentagon, the White House, and about a dozen allied military commands. What you're doing out there has become bigger than anyone anticipated. The Secretary of Defense wants me to tell you that you're representing not just the Marines, but the entire United States military. No pressure." James received similar words from his superiors. The Queen herself had been briefed on the situation, and word had come down through military channels that the royal family was aware of the extraordinary attention the guard duty had generated. For a royal guard, there was no higher honor than knowing the monarch was personally aware of your service. As the two men prepared for what everyone knew would be their final day together, the weight of global attention was palpable. But both had reached a point where external pressures had become background noise. They had discovered something in themselves over the previous 2 days, a capacity for focus and endurance that exceeded even their own expectations. The crowd's behavior had evolved as well. What had started as curious observation had transformed into something approaching reverence. People understood instinctively that they were witnessing a demonstration of human capability that was both inspiring and humbling. When the guards took their positions for the final time, the silence that fell over the massive crowd was absolute. Thousands of people stood in perfect quiet, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a religious ceremony than a tourist attraction. The morning passed with an intensity that seemed to affect everyone present. Both guards had settled into a state of perfect stillness that appeared almost supernatural to the watching crowd. Their breathing was barely visible, their eyes focused on distant points that seemed to exist beyond the physical world around them. Around midday, something unexpected happened that would be remembered and discussed for years afterward. A small child, no more than 5 years old, broke away from her parents and began walking toward the guards. The crowd held its breath as palace security moved to intercept her. But she stopped just short of the barriers and did something that surprised everyone. She stood at attention. Her small body straightened into the best approximation of military bearing that a 5-year-old could manage. She remained perfectly still for nearly 10 minutes, her young face serious with concentration, before her parents finally coaxed her back to their side. The image of that little girl standing guard alongside the two soldiers was captured by dozens of cameras, and within hours had become one of the most shared photos in social media history. Something about the scene captured the imagination of people around the world, the idea that dedication and honor could inspire even the youngest observers to rise to their highest potential. As the afternoon progressed, the crowd continued to grow. Estimates put the number of spectators at over 50,000 people, making it one of the largest gatherings in London's recent history. The police had closed several surrounding streets to accommodate the crowds, and the London Underground had added extra trains to handle the unprecedented demand. But it was the quality of the silence that made the biggest impression on everyone present. 50,000 people maintaining near-perfect quiet for hours at a time was unprecedented. The guards had somehow inspired the entire crowd to match their own level of discipline and focus. Inside that silence, Marcus and James had reached a state that few people ever experience. They had transcended the normal boundaries of physical endurance and mental concentration to achieve something approaching perfection in their chosen profession. Every aspect of their training, every lesson learned through years of service, had culminated in this moment. As the sun began to set on what everyone knew would be their final hours together, both guards remained as motionless and focused as they had been at dawn. They had now spent 3 days demonstrating a level of commitment that redefined what most people believed was possible. The crowd sensed that something significant was approaching. As the time for the evening shift change drew near, the atmosphere became even more charged with emotion. Many spectators had tears in their eyes as they realized they were witnessing the conclusion of something truly extraordinary. When the relief guards finally arrived to take over the posts, the transition happened with ceremony that reflected the magnitude of what had occurred. Both Marcus and James executed perfect military protocol, saluting their replacements and stepping back from their positions with movements that remained precise despite their exhaustion. As they turned away from their posts for the final time, something unprecedented happened. The massive crowd, which had maintained respectful silence for 3 days, erupted in applause that could be heard for miles. It was not the cheering of entertainment, but the kind of deep emotional appreciation that people reserve for witnessing genuine greatness. Neither guard acknowledged the applause directly. Their training wouldn't permit such a breach of protocol, but both men were visibly moved by the response. They had accomplished something that transcended military duty and had become a demonstration of human potential that inspired people around the world. In the days that followed, the story continued to resonate globally. Military academies used footage of the 3-day vigil as training material, showing cadets what perfect discipline looked like in practice. The video became required viewing in leadership courses, demonstrating how individual excellence could inspire entire communities to rise to higher standards. Marcus returned to his unit in the United States with a new understanding of what service meant. The experience had shown him that the impact of military professionalism extended far beyond the immediate mission. That perfect execution of duty could serve as a beacon of inspiration for anyone seeking to achieve excellence in their own life. James continued his service with the Royal Guard, but carried with him the knowledge that he had participated in something historic. The bond formed with Marcus during those 3 days remained strong, and the two men maintained a friendship that bridged nations and services. Years later, when military historians looked back on the event, they struggled to explain exactly why two soldiers doing their routine duty had captured global attention in such a profound way. But those who were present understood that they had witnessed something rare and valuable, a perfect demonstration of what human beings can achieve when they commit themselves completely to excellence. The story became legend within military circles, told and retold as an example of how individual dedication could embody the highest ideals of service. But for those who stood in that crowd during those 3 remarkable days, it remained something more personal, proof that in a world often filled with compromise and mediocrity, it was still possible to witness perfection achieved through simple, unwavering commitment to doing one's duty with absolute excellence. The Marine and the Royal Guard had faced off in silence, and in that silence they had shown the world what true strength looked like.